Hi, everybody. I hope all of you are staying healthy during this crazy time and that online classes are going well for you. I was assigned chapter 19, which is motor development, and some of the things we will be covering is what is motor development, categories of movement, the dynamic systems theory, the phases of motor development, and the fact that motor development is very individualized. So, what is motor development? All of you probably have this down to a T, as this is something we PE majors talk a lot about. Motor development is a progressive change in movement behavior throughout the life cycle. It involves continuous adaptation as a person's movement capabilities change through stages of life. The book talks a lot about how motor development can be studied as both a process and a product. When studied as a process, the focus is on things that influence motor performance and capabilities from like when you're a newborn all the way through old age. And as a product, the focus is much more broad and looks at all the different phases and stages, which we will get into in a little bit. There's different categories of movement that we will discuss briefly. All three categories discuss how it applies to newborns, infants, and those in childhood and beyond. The first is stability. This is the most basic form of movement and is seen in just about everything we do. The book describes it as this. A stability movement is any movement that places a premium on gaining and maintaining equilibrium in relation to the force of gravity. So there's three phases to every category. First are the newborns. In this phase, stability looks like controlling the muscles of the head, neck, and trunk. Second is infancy, and they should be able to sit and stand on their own. And then individuals in childhood and beyond, they should be able to stand without support, balance on one foot, twist and turn, reach and lift, everything we're basically able to do right now. For a person with a central nervous system disorder, developing movement tasks might be delayed a bit. So if someone is born with cerebral palsy, the development process will look much different, where independent sitting and walking might take much longer. Locomotion is the second category and is defined as movements that involve a change in location of the body relative to a fixed point on the surface. Examples of this include movements like walking, running, jumping, leaping, skipping, things like that. For the individual who uses a wheelchair, locomotor skills would look different, but are equally important and effective. And they can things like moving a chair forward or backwards or in a zigzag pattern. The third category is manipulation, which refers to both gross and fine motor skills. Gross movements include things like throwing, catching, kicking, and fine motor skills, as we know, are smaller movements like cutting with scissors, tying shoelaces, snapping, typing, things like that. For individuals with disabilities that depend heavily on other people, mastering these manipulative skills like grasping and releasing silverware, or like when you're eating, raising a fork or a spoon to their mouth with control is really significant. For example, somebody with a spinal cord injury would really want to strive to accomplish these things, as that would greatly decrease the dependence on other people. All three categories, stability, locomotion, and manipulation, are typically seen in all forms of movement, especially stability. All voluntary movements involve some sort of stability, and that's why it's the most basic category. Next, we'll look at motor development as a dynamic system. The main point of this section is that developmental change is nonlinear and discontinuous. Individual change over a large chunk of time isn't always going to be smooth, and there's really no specific order. For the child with cerebral palsy, learning to walk independently is delayed. So my uncle, who's here on the left in this picture with me, was born with cerebral palsy, and that drastically changed the time frame of motor development for him compared to his classmates. Where a typical child learns to walk at roughly like 14 months, he didn't learn to walk until around 5 or 6. So he was involved in a patterning program for several months, and it's because of that that he was able to take his first steps. He's now 40 years old and is mainly in a wheelchair. His walking ability is much more limited, and whenever he does walk, a walker is definitely necessary. So there's varying levels of severity when it comes to this specific disability. Some kids will never learn to walk, some will learn super quick. This again just goes to show how individual the process is. The term system refers to the idea that our body is self-organizing and is made of several subsystems. Self-organizing meaning we naturally strive to know how to control our bodies. And the subsystems refer to the task, the individual, and the environment. All of those things determine the rate and the sequence and the extent of one's development. There's no specific developmental plan for all of us to follow. The process is going to look really different for everyone. In the chapter, we go on to learn about affordances and rate limiters that play a big role in the overall process. Affordances are the things that promote development, whereas rate limiters restrict it. So for the child with cerebral palsy, the rate limiters are neurological and they can't really control that. And then affordances would be like handholds or a walker or guided instruction, which that could be for anybody. All of us, disabled or not, have experienced both affordances and rate limiters. Heredity and environment play a key role in the process as well. And as adapted physical educators, as we analyze each student, it's important to recognize the environment and hereditary factors for each individual so that ultimately we can adapt and promote learning. The bottom line to this whole dynamic systems thing is that all individuals have their own time frame as to when and how they're going to learn these motor skills. Age only represents like an approximate time frame where certain behaviors take place, but nothing more than that. So we're now going to move to the phases of motor development, and I think many of you have seen this image before, the hourglass. In this model, there are 4 phases: reflexive, rudimentary, fundamental, and specialized. Within those phases are different stages. As you can see, there are 2 factors that play a role in the overall competence and ability regarding movement, and I just mentioned those, heredity and environment. And those are both really different for everybody. So, for example, some kids participate in club sports, whereas others stick to just the school season. And a big factor in that is the cost. So socioeconomic status for each family is much different. And some kids can't afford to be involved in club sports. Some people think people in club sports have a really big advantage. I don't think it makes a huge difference. But that's definitely an environmental example. It's fun to think back and make a list of these factors for your own life. If you just want to think about it in your head or actually make your own list. I had to do that for a class, and it's actually a good way to reflect on how you got to where you are today. So reflexive movement is the first phase. Reactions toward light, sound, pressure change, and touch are all involuntary and can help children learn more about themselves and the outside world. This phase can be divided into two stages of information encoding and decoding. The encoding stage, or gathering stage, includes involuntary movement during the fetal period through roughly the 4th month of infancy. And in the book it states, during this stage, reflexes serve as the primary means through which the infant is able to gather information, seek nourishment, and seek protection through movement. There's many different evaluations of infant reflexes that are used as a way to screen for different developmental problems, and one is observation and reflex testing. That's one way to diagnose and test for possible central nervous system disorders. Rudimentary phase is next. In this phase, we see the first voluntary forms of movement from birth to roughly age 2. Movements include control of the head and neck, sitting, standing independently, reaching, grasping, or releasing. This is a picture of my niece on the left. I just found it in my photos and it works. She's probably 15, 16 months in that photo, and she's standing by herself playing with coasters, so that's just kind of a rudimentary phase visual. So the reflexes we just learned about are now being replaced by voluntary movement behaviors. And in this video, this just kind of gives another quick visual after this ad.
It's not the same without it.
So that's just another quick visual of the rudimentary phase. The next is fundamental. This phase is essential to the learning and progression of overall movement skills. For example, throwing a ball for distance is important before throwing for accuracy. You learn to walk before you run, bend and stretch before you twist. This is just kind of a prerequisite, I guess, before you get to the specialized. Typically 2 and 3-year-olds are in this stage, and that's the initial stage. And then we have emerging, where you find 3 to 5-year-olds, and that's where they begin to gain more coordination and control. And then lastly is proficient, where your 6 to 7-year-olds are, and they're much more coordinated and efficient. It's critical that in this stage there's opportunity for a lot of practice and that kids get a lot of support from adults. So for us as PE teachers, this goes for students in wheelchairs or any type of disability. They need the same opportunities to practice these skills so they can move forward in their own timeline of development as well. Overall success in this phase for everybody is going to increase the chances of kids being successful later as they start to participate in recreational activities and organized sports. I also put in pictures and charts. It gives a movement and then the approximate age as to when that movement is going to take place. So you can kind of look at those closer if you want. Finally is the specialized phase. the book states